Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on managing commercial auto risk beyond the fleet. My name is Erica Baird, and I'm a risk control manager with Safety National, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today about auto and fleet safety. But we're going to cover a couple of housekeeping items first. So this presentation will be sent out as a recording via email to both attendees and registrants, and the slides will be available to you as a PDF after today's presentation. If you have any questions as we're going through the materials, please submit them using the question tab in the top right corner of your screen. We have tried to save some time at the end of the presentation so we can go over questions, but if we don't get to all of the questions today, they'll be addressed in a future article in Carrier Chronicles. The goal of this presentation is first to make sure that you're aware of your fleet and auto exposures, and also to share some best practices for managing fleet and auto risks beyond to managing your fleet and auto risks. And then also we're going to cover some common pitfalls that can get some organizations into trouble, just to bring them to your attention and make you aware. So today we're going to touch on auto liability, and we're going to get into some of the scary things that are happening with nuclear verdicts right now. But our focus is really on ensuring that you've identified where you have driving exposures and that you've established systems that ensure that you have the right drivers, you have well-maintained vehicles, and driver expectations in place that protect your organization, and also that you've got training and leading practices in place to help to prevent incidents. We're also going to talk about some of the tools that are available to help organizations manage their fleet program and to reinforce expectations. But we're going to start with a poll question. So I've built a couple of questions into this presentation. They're completely anonymous, and mostly they're just to get a feel for what kind of fleet risks you have. So our first question is, how would you describe your company's use of vehicles? If you've got a good-sized fleet, you would probably select option A. If you work for a company that has some pool cars available that employees share, you might select option B. If at your organization, your employees drive their own vehicles and they meet with customers or they're picking up supplies, that's option C. Or you might have all of these risks or none of these risks. So just go ahead and choose the option that makes the most sense to you. And I'm watching the numbers here. Looks like most of you have a pretty big fleet, or you have all of the above. Let's see where we end up. It's staying right in that range. Just a few people with pool cars. Not a lot of people saying they have employees who drive their own vehicles. I think this is going to time out in just a second here. All right, so I'm going to move forward. It looks like large fleet of company vehicles, 35%, or all of the above, 34%. So that's most of our attendees. A couple of people with none of the above. Pool cars, only 6% of you have pool cars, and employees who drive vehicles, their own vehicles for various purposes, we're at 14%. So look, when it comes to auto liability, it's important for you to know who's driving cars for business purposes. And sometimes it's really obvious, right? You're hiring drivers, they're going to use a company vehicle, whether it's a tractor trailer, a box truck, a sedan, but you know they're drivers, right? And then if there are people who drive commercial vehicles, they have regulatory requirements they have to meet for licensing, for medical assessments, drug testing, tracking their hours of service, and that's all set by the Department of Transportation. Most companies who have drivers that fit into that category, they already know what they have to do to meet DOT standards. It's their other drivers that are sometimes missed. The reality is that most businesses have some kind of auto exposure. You might not have a fleet of semis, but you have an employee who runs to the bank once a week, or who runs to the hardware store to pick up supplies. You've got somebody who's delivering food to customers. You've got employees who are driving between customer locations, or they're driving between job sites throughout the day. There's a company policy in place that offers either mileage reimbursement or a vehicle stipend to certain employee classifications. Every one of those is an example of a company that has an auto liability exposure. So whether you have a huge fleet or just somebody who's driving their own vehicle for business purposes, you can be on the hook if there's an accident. You can't just bury your head in the sand and pretend that this doesn't exist. You really have to be proactive so you can protect the organization, protect your employees, and protect the public, because the consequences can be severe. This is a chart from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it really kind of starts to scratch the surface of why we need to dig into this data. This data is from calendar year 2024, and it shows the different types of events or exposures that led to occupational fatalities. the number one cause of workplace fatalities is transportation. And I'm showing you 2024, but this has been the same for years and years and years, right? We see this over and over again. So those employees who are driving to the bank or the hardware store, they're delivering food, whatever transportation is necessary to operate your business, that can lead to fatal incidents. And that's an important thing to think about, right? This data is just showing us employee incidents, right? It's not capturing what happened to the other people who were involved in those incidents. In 2024, there were 5,070 fatal workplace incidents, and 1,937 of them involved transportation. So we're talking about almost 40% of work-related fatalities fall under transportation. So this is important from the perspective of employee safety when we start thinking about anyone else injured in these accidents, right? It may be important from a liability standpoint too. So when there is a car accident, there's some obvious direct costs, right? The cost to repair or replace the vehicles that were damaged in the crash, that's one direct cost. Another one is the cost of medical care for anyone who's injured in the accident. So let's talk about what that could look like. The network of employers for traffic safety reported that in 2019, the average cost for an employer for a work-related motor vehicle crash on the highway was $26,084, and the average cost of a crash where somebody was injured was $74,418. Average in this case is telling us that there's a couple that were a little bit more minor than this. There were a couple that were a little bit more serious than that, right? So there's a range that we're talking about. But serious and fatality incidents, those were the ones that are going to increase those loss costs dramatically. And then when we start looking at direct costs like medical care and property damage, and we add in indirect costs, that can really add up. And there's a lot of variables. So to really dig into this and just make the point, we're going to work our way towards a worst case scenario, right? What could happen? What gets us to that point where we're talking about a nuclear verdict? When I look at losses for my clients, I frequently see rear end incidents. So I'm going to use that as an example, and we're going to see how it can get to a worst case scenario. A lot of times employees are just driving along, right? Someone in front of them slams on their brakes. And if he doesn't react quickly enough, he's going to run into that car in front of him. If he's going fast enough, he might push that car into the one in front of them. So now you're looking at 2 cars damaged. And we're going to do a little bit of rough math on this. In 2026, Auto Trader and JD Power estimated that the average value of a used car was somewhere between $25,600 and $30,166. So if we totaled both of those cars in that accident, we're looking at property damage somewhere in the range of $50,000 to $60,000, right? And then based on that description, probably somebody got hurt in that accident. So we're adding to that cost even more, and we're starting to look at a pretty decent amount of money for that auto accident, right? But because we're working our way to the worst case scenario, we're going to make it a little bit scarier. Your driver who is in that accident, he's operating a fully loaded semi. And the car that he hit was a compact car that crashed into the vehicle in front of it. That semi is a big vehicle and fully loaded. It weighs a lot more than the car that it hit. So what's it going to do to that compact car? At this point, we're really not talking about average costs anymore. We're talking about something a lot more serious. So let's say that the person in that compact car, they're very seriously injured, and she gets an attorney. She sues your company, and it goes to court. And the attorney, going through discovery, he finds out that you have in-cab cameras. And they show that the reason your driver didn't stop quickly enough was because he fell asleep. Or maybe he was looking at his phone, right? You can see how this can start to go downhill really fast, right? The liability costs on this just went up significantly. Nuclear verdicts are the ones where the jury award exceeds $10 million. And data shows that these are happening a lot more frequently. These awards often result because the attorney can demonstrate that an employer didn't do something that they should have done to prevent an incident from occurring. It could be anything from improper vehicle maintenance to letting a driver continue to drive without taking the required rest break. It could also be that they hired someone to drive who wasn't properly licensed or who had a history of moving violations, and that should have been a red flag. So how do organizations address these things? You have to assess the risk and put the right controls in place based on your operations. So we're going to cover some different controls, some policy ideas, procedures, some tools and emergency technology today, so you can really look at what you have in place and then see if something that you learned about today might help to improve your fleet programs. Before we get into those solutions, though, I want to make a couple more points about the cost of accidents and specifically about indirect costs, which I mentioned before. We know that when an employee is injured, there are other costs associated with it that aren't covered by insurance. And we use this iceberg analogy to try and demonstrate that indirect costs are often significantly more than the direct costs of the accident. That hidden part of the iceberg that's underwater, often far greater than the portion that we can see above the water. And the same is true about the proportion of costs that are easily recognized in auto accidents and then the costs that are more hidden, right? So I want you to start thinking not just about how bad an accident could be, but about organizational liability and the long-term impact of serious incidents. So in this case, after a vehicle accident, the driver and anybody else who's in the vehicle with them might not be able to work. So the vehicle itself might require repairs before it can be used again. So you're down one or more employees and a vehicle, and all of that affects your operations and production. Other employees might be upset about the accident, right? They found out somebody got hurt and they're not really able to focus on work. And then the driver's supervisor is probably going to have to do an accident investigation, take some time away from her other job duties, right? All of those things take away from production as well. If this is a serious incident and it managed to get into the local news, then you're looking at potential reputation impact. And that can impact your existing customer relationships. So a customer might see this in the news and have some concerns because there was a serious incident. All of these are hidden costs, right? Lower productivity, loss of customer confidence, loss of equipment, all of those indirect costs impact your organization. And there really are dollar signs associated with that, even if it's kind of hard to put an exact number on it. But the good news is that most of these losses are preventable with the right controls in place. So with that, let's do one more poll question. I said one more, but this is not the last one. All right, this poll question is a bit of a knowledge test. So again, these answers are anonymous. We don't know who's saying what. If you get it right, go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back. If you get it wrong, that's great. We're going to learn something new. So this question asks, which of these vehicles creates liability for an organization when used for work? A company-owned pickup truck. B, an employee's pickup truck. C, an employee-rented pickup truck. Or D, all of the above. Take a second, look at the answers, and then go ahead and click on what you think is the most applicable. I think we've got about 20 seconds left. Getting some good answers here. And the numbers are holding pretty steady at this point. We've got about 95% of you who said D, all of the above, and that is the correct answer. Any vehicle that's used for business purposes, aka for work, right, can create liability for the company. That auto liability exposure, right, it's not just your company-owned vehicles, right? Owned vehicles are the ones that the company purchased or leased, right? Non-owned vehicles are the ones that either employees own and use for work, or maybe you have employees who travel for work and they rent cars, right? Those are also non-owned vehicles. Each arrangement creates its own risk considerations, but the common thread is this. If employees are driving on behalf of your organization, you want to have expectations and controls in place that are really clear. So how do you know if people are using non-owned vehicles for business purposes within your organization? Personal vehicle use often shows up in two ways. One is through mileage reimbursement. They're getting paid for the miles that they drive their vehicle. And the second one is through a vehicle allowance program. So they get money towards the cost of the vehicles because they use it for work. If you have either of those, you have an exposure. If employees rent cars when they travel, that's going to also fall into this category. So a couple of things to consider there. As soon as your employee drives a vehicle for business purposes, the organization can become liable for the accidents that they're involved in anytime they're using that car for work. Now, if you're thinking, wait, Erica, come on, they have their own insurance. My answer to you is I really hope that you're right. But if you haven't verified that they have their own insurance, you don't know that. So when your employees are operating their own personal vehicles and the organization has limited control over that vehicle condition, you've got limited control over driver behavior, and most importantly, you have limited control over what insurance coverage they have. And that can create potential gaps in protection, including insufficient limits, lack of coverage, or claim denials because of policy restrictions. And all of that leaves the organization responsible for costs above what the employee's policy provides. The best way to manage this is to know who's driving what vehicle and put some guidelines in place for insurance requirements that meet your needs. I also recommend speaking with your insurance broker just to make sure that you fully protected the organization based on your own unique situation. So how do organizations manage this non-owned auto exposure? It's going to be different for every organization, and you have to decide what is and isn't acceptable risk for you. Recommended practice is to apply all the same guidelines and expectations to drivers of non-owned vehicles that you have in place for drivers of owned vehicles. Then, organizations typically require proof of insurance for anyone who uses their own vehicle for work. Second, you should consider as an organization and in collaboration with your broker who's going to better understand your insurance policies and your operations, whether you want to require employees to have insurance that exceeds the state minimum requirements and what amount you're going to require them to have. Third, all drivers should have to meet the same expectations for driving safely and meet your driver eligibility requirements. They also should get training on your fleet program as it applies to them, and then on related safety topics like defensive and distracted driving. And then finally, and this is a little bit more controversial, but think about doing periodic vehicle inspections just to make sure that those cars are in safe operating condition. I know some organizations aren't comfortable with that, and I get it, but remember that if that vehicle's condition leads to an accident, then you could end up liable for some of the associated costs. And it could also just leave your employees stuck on the side of the road in an unsafe situation, right? So we want to make sure those vehicles are in good condition and safe to operate. So now that you know what vehicles are used to represent your organization, you want to make sure that you have a complete fleet program in place and that it incorporates all of those vehicles and drivers. Your fleet safety program starts with who you hire to drive your vehicles, right? You should have established standards that an applicant has to meet in order to be eligible to drive on behalf of the organization. Driver training is another must. So just look at any other safety program that you have, right? You're gonna have to set expectations for your drivers, and you have to train them on the hazards of the road and how you expect them to handle those hazards. Your vehicles should be inspected by drivers before they're driven each day. If something's wrong with a vehicle and they drive it anyway and an accident occurs as a result, it can put your employees and others at risk, and it increases your liability exposure. Vehicles that are not operating correctly or that require repairs should not be operated until those repairs are completed. Your drivers need to understand as part of their training and the onboarding that what your expectations are for how they should behave on the road. Generally, this includes reminding them that they have to follow traffic safety laws, they have to wear a seatbelt, and they should not be driving if they're impaired. And it should also make clear your expectations for cell phone use. Your fleet plan should address how drivers will be monitored, whether that's through going on ride-alongs with them or telematics data, right? And then what are the consequences for them if they're not meeting your driver expectations? Additionally, in the event that you have a driver who is in an accident, you want to make sure that your plan makes it clear how they're supposed to handle that. Who are they supposed to call? Where's the vehicle insurance and registration documents? When should they take photos? And how do you want them to interact with police if they show up on the scene, right? All of these controls work best when they're clearly written, applied consistently, and supported by leadership. All right, so I want to cover two legal concepts that make managing fleet and auto exposures really essential for an employer: vicarious liability and negligent entrustment. Vicarious liability is the concept that you can be held responsible for the actions of someone else based on your relationship. So parent and child is one example of a relationship with vicarious liability. If your child is in a car accident, you can be held liable for the cost of vehicle repairs and medical bills. Same concept also applies to relationship between employer and employee. If you make your employee responsible for something and they don't do it right, they don't follow through, or they do something wrong, it falls back on you as the employer. Employers are generally responsible for the actions of their employees who are driving on behalf of the organization. Vicarious liability makes fleet safety more than just a transportation issue, it becomes a risk management issue. Ultimately, the employer is the one who's deciding which drivers are authorized to operate vehicles on behalf of the organization. And because of this, if an employee does something that may be considered negligent, the employer can be held liable. If the employer knew or should have known that the driver was likely to drive in a way that could cause harm to others, then that falls under negligent entrustment. I want to stress that last statement. If you should have known based on due diligence that an employee should not be driving, your organization can be held liable for harm under negligent entrustment. This is one of those areas that leads to those nuclear verdicts that we talked about a little while ago. Clear driver expectations, driver vetting, and consistent oversight, and documented decision-making all matter when it comes to driver eligibility. So let's talk about driver eligibility. This is the criteria that helps an organization decide who's qualified to operate vehicles for business purposes. And it's usually documented in your fleet program, so it's transparent and everybody understands what the rules are. Typical standards include a minimum age or driving experience. So for example, you might have a guideline that says only drivers 18 and older, or those with at least 2 years of experience are permitted to drive. Or if your operations are a little bit more concerning, you might want your drivers to be older or have more experience, right? You have to make that decision for yourself. Determining what is acceptable is part of building your fleet policy. So generally, the criteria also states that drivers must have a valid driver's license and an acceptable loss history. There should also be a defined threshold for violations or at-fault accidents. And if an applicant has too many tickets or they have too many accidents, then they might not be considered eligible to drive on behalf of the organization. So you're setting out exactly how you're going to determine who is and isn't eligible. The value of that criteria lies not just in what it says, but in how consistently it's applied. You want to make sure it's applied consistently. Motor vehicle records, or MVRs, provide data that you can use to assess driver eligibility based on predetermined criteria. A motor vehicle record will tell you about prior convictions, suspensions, and even license revocations. MVR reviews are the most important tool that you have to ensure that your employees' driving records don't have any red flags. If you use them before hiring and during employment, that review makes sure that you have the information that you need to determine if an employee no longer meets your criteria or shouldn't even be hired as a driver. MVR data combined with driver criteria helps organizations rely on established rules and expectations instead of using informal judgment to decide who will and will not be able to drive. And the data available in an MVR supports fairness, consistency, and stronger risk decision-making for authorizing your employees to drive on behalf of the organization. At a minimum, you want to review those MVRs regularly. Some organizations go further than that. They might use a continuous monitoring service, either through a state program or a vendor service, where it flags new convictions or violations. These are helpful because it helps an employer recognize when an employee no longer meets their eligibility requirements, even if that employee didn't notify anyone. Really, the right approach to this depends on your fleet size, exposures, and resources, but the goal is the same. We want to reduce the amount of time between an employee having a disqualifying event, like having a ticket or change in their license status, like a suspension, right? And when the employer knows about it. Your driver's MVR records can become a huge problem after an accident. This is data that you have access to and should be reviewing to decide if they're eligible to operate a company vehicle or to drive on behalf of the company. And failing to do a review, failing to look at this data puts a huge hole in any kind of liability defense. If a driver has a history of reckless driving or driving under the influence, and they're still authorized to operate a company vehicle and they repeat this kind of behavior on the job, it is incredibly problematic. MVR reviews are part of your due diligence when it comes to hiring and authorizing a person to drive. Many fleet programs distinguish between major and minor violations. So major violations, things like driving under the influence, reckless driving, or vehicular manslaughter, those often trigger an automatic disqualification. Minor violations are usually they're assessed using a point system, right? So once an employee has a certain number of points based on their MVR, they might no longer be eligible to drive for the company. This helps to eliminate any kind of guessing in that review process, and it makes sure that the standard is applied consistently and objectively to all employees. So for example, as an organization, you might think one speeding ticket under 10 miles per hour over the speed limit is acceptable, but 3 tickets like that maybe are not, right? So that's the kind of criteria that you're putting in place. Your fleet policies should clearly require your drivers to report motor vehicle convictions, license suspensions, and health changes that may affect their ability to drive safely. This is to protect the organization. Your drivers are going to need a lot of reminders about this, right? So you want to reinforce it with your supervisors, make sure that they're reinforcing it, and also you remind everyone during training on a regular basis just to keep it front of mind. It can also be useful to make sure that drivers understand why this is so important, right? Make sure that they understand that it is not acceptable for them to continue to operate a company vehicle if their license is suspended. And if they're not permitted to drive by law, then they can't be driving on behalf of the company. It is also important for employees to understand that some medical conditions and medications can make it unsafe for them to drive. So they need to notify their supervisor if they have medical conditions that might, for example, cause them to lose consciousness, or if they're taking medications that can make them drowsy, right? Either of those can make it more risky for them to continue driving. Another area that can create liability for an organization is the state of the vehicles that are used. Okay, so any vehicle that's not properly maintained can lead to accidents. And when that happens, the employer can end up looking like they intentionally chose to do something that put others at risk. It is absolutely vital to have records of vehicle maintenance and to keep track of when vehicles are due for service. I'm going to acknowledge, though, that there can be barriers to ensuring that vehicles are well maintained. And one is with drivers, right? Your drivers, sometimes they get a little attached to their car, right? Drivers who know that submitting a ticket for a repair means that they're going to lose their vehicle indefinitely means your vehicles are not going to get fixed. They're going to keep driving them in an unsafe condition because they don't want to be without their car. So don't put your drivers in this position. Vehicle repairs can't extend to weeks and months, and drivers should never, ever be admonished for ensuring that their vehicle is well maintained. If you have backup vehicles, right, make sure that they're in good condition so people don't feel like they're missing out if they have to drive their backup vehicles. This is really an area where setting expectations can make the difference. So if the expectation for employees is to only operate a vehicle that is clean inside and out and that passes inspection, you're already a step ahead, right? Your vehicles need to get that regular maintenance, tire rotations, oil changes, all on a set schedule. Records of maintenance and repairs and inspections should be maintained for every vehicle. And all of this documentation, it's really important as a record to show that you as an organization are taking the proper steps to ensure that vehicles are in safe operating condition. Safe drivers need safe drivers need safe vehicles. So beyond the liability piece we focused on already so heavily, I wanted to point out that you want your employees to be safe when they're on the road, right? Well-maintained vehicles are a huge part of that. Your fleet program should address preventive maintenance, routine inspections, and expectations for the condition of personal vehicles used for company business. We talked a little bit about inspections on the last slide. Before they're operating a vehicle, your drivers should be walking around that car and making sure that it's in good condition, right? So they're going to do an inspection, different for different types of vehicles, but your inspection should be documented either on paper or electronically, either way. If your team is likely to just choose good for everything, right? They're just going to check everything off. You want to find ways to make them do it right, because that documentation, if it's faked, right, it's not going to help you. So you can require employees to do things like take photos of the vehicle and submit them with the inspection, or you could do random vehicle inspections yourself just to verify that vehicles are really being maintained. These are just some of the questions that quick inspection should be able to address on the slide, right? It's not a comprehensive list, but what you don't want is an employee who's operating a vehicle that doesn't have working windshield wipers or has sluggish brakes, or they have a windshield that's so cracked and dirty that they can't even see through it, right? All of those are going to lead to accidents. These inspections help to prevent anyone from ending up stuck on the side of the road or getting into one of those preventable accidents. But remember, you do have to set the standard for what you expect your vehicles to look like and the condition that they should be in, and you have to enforce it, right? Make sure everybody understands. Part of making sure people understand your standards is using training. So training is another fleet practice that you want to maintain documentation for. And we're going to start with new hires, right? So somebody got through your application process, they met your driver criteria, they're hired. Now they have to be trained on your expectations when it comes to operating a vehicle. You can't rely on their good judgment or the fact that they've been driving for 20 years. What do you expect from your drivers? You've got to set the stage for how you want them to behave from the very beginning. You should also assess their skills and provide coaching for any deficiencies that you observe. Make sure that they're comfortable with their assigned vehicle, right? Sometimes company vehicles are larger and heavier than the cars that people use in their personal lives. So make sure that they're comfortable driving it, or see if they need some additional training so that they're able to safely park it, back up, and maneuver around common obstacles. These are things you want to assess and then address. New employees also need to know that they have to notify you if they're convicted of a moving violation after hire, and what your procedure is for reporting incidents that happen away from the office. So what are your expectations for a driver involved in an accident? right? We touched on this before, but are they going to collect insurance information from the other driver? Are they going to call you right away so that you can come on site and handle that? Make sure your employees know what the process is and what they need to do. And then finally, company vehicles often have your company name and logo on them. So it's really important that your employees understand that they literally represent your organization to the public. Remind new drivers that people are going to know who they work for when they're driving, and that the expectation is that they treat other drivers with courtesy and respect. Okay, this is our last poll question. It's really just about what you're seeing in your workplace. So there's not a right or wrong answer here. And maybe you have a different type of auto accident that you see more frequently, but these are the ones that I see a lot when I review loss data. So the question is, what are the most common types of motor vehicle accidents occurring at your organization? Is it drivers that back into other vehicles or objects? Is it improper lane changes or side swipes you might see? Is it incidents in intersections or rear end incidents? Let's see what people say. Everybody knows I'm seeing quick answers come in. All right, and the numbers are starting to hold kind of steady, so I'm going to read them through. Drivers backing into other vehicles and objects looks like the top thing that you guys see. So I'm around 48, 49% that's jumping around. Improper lane change at 7%, incidents in intersections 14%, and then rear end incidents jumping around between 33 and 34. So yeah, that's definitely what I see a lot of as well. Why do you need to know that, right? Your drivers really need to receive ongoing safety reminders. So that regular training and reminders that reinforces your expectations. So if we go from new hires to your regular drivers who've been working with you for a while, right? Reminders about your loading procedures can be important. Reminders about your safety rules and standard operating procedures, always important. Reinforcing traffic laws regarding speeding and stopping at stop signs or red lights, that's all good reminders, right? If your drivers think a yellow light means go faster, it's just a recipe for an intersection accident, right? We want to make sure that they are thinking safely. So going back to what we were just talking about, focus your training a little bit on where you're seeing the most incidents. So if your drivers are hitting a lot of stationary objects, which is what I'm hearing, what's the root cause of that? If they're rear-ending vehicles a lot, why is that happening? What's causing those incidents? If you can figure out what's causing those accidents and provide targeted training to address it, just like any other accident, right? We're going to investigate, find the root cause, and then make sure your other drivers are aware so that they're not making the same mistake. So there's different ways to handle those common issues once you've identified them. When we're talking about backing into things, right? Consider that you might have a blind spot in your vehicles and your drivers might not be thinking about it or aware of it or addressing it. So maybe you want them to use a spotter when they're backing, okay? Or maybe they just need to be more aware of that blind spot. If you're having a lot of incidents at intersections, maybe you want to reroute your drivers so they avoid specific intersections where you've identified that it's unsafe. Or if it's rear end incidents, I think that was our second option. We want to remind our drivers to maintain safe distance between the vehicles in front of them, right? So knowing what's causing those incidents, digging into that data, and then giving them the information that they need to drive safely is really, really important. And then make sure that your drivers are clear about the safe behaviors you expect them to demonstrate. So common courtesy and respect for other drivers on the road is one thing, but be clear about your expectation that everyone in the vehicle has to wear a seatbelt. I think most of us just assume at this point that everybody already does this. But if your drivers have to get in and out of their vehicle frequently, they might leave their seatbelt off because it's a shortcut. So be really clear about your expectations around using seatbelts. And then also be clear about cell phones, right? So when are they allowed to use cell phones and when are they not? There's a lot of data out there that suggests that hands-free devices don't actually solve the problem of distracted driving. But there are a lot of organizations that also feel like they have to be able to contact their employees for various reasons when they're out on the road. In some states, most states really, there's laws in place that apply. So at a minimum, reinforce your expectations that employees follow the laws for mobile device usage. And then I strongly encourage organizations to take strong stance on this, just because there's so many accidents that occur as a result of distraction. So think about how you can make sure that your drivers are safe before they take a call. Reinforce those expectations about impairment as well, and that should align with your drug and alcohol policies. Most companies follow a zero tolerance policy, but whatever you have in place, that's what should follow through. And then make sure your drivers know the consequences of violating any of your safety rules or driving unsafely. So at this point, I would say that most organizations that I talk to that have large fleets work with a company that also tracks their telematics. And many of them have both cab-facing and exterior cameras. These cameras are great for seeing how your drivers respond to different things and if they're wearing their seatbelts or using their cell phones, right? It's helpful to look at those things. They can also come in handy when an accident occurs because then it's not one driver's version of events versus the other. There's actually video that can show what's going on. Telematics data today can also help with tracking vehicle maintenance needs and identify if there are low fluids or vehicles are running hot, so you can make sure you're on top of those maintenance and repairs. It's great. Except sometimes it's not, because sometimes the data for telematics can get overwhelming for the people who receive notifications. And some employees have strong feelings about being reported. So best practices for telematics data. You can usually set the point at which you receive a notification. If you put everything at the very lowest level, then you might receive far more notifications than you can actually manage when it comes to coaching your employees. So really consider what you do and don't need to know and adjust those triggers so that the number of notifications is manageable. And then make sure that supervisors, fleet managers, whoever's supposed to coach your employees is following your disciplinary action plan and documents the interactions. Before a new employee starts or before you implement a new system for collecting telematics data, talk to your employees so that they understand how and why the data is being collected and how it's going to be used. Data collected by these systems provides a lot of tools for managing fleet, but it's also data that is available and discoverable in a lawsuit. So if you receive notifications repeatedly about one person who's later involved in a collision and your records don't show that you addressed it, that data can be used against you. You cannot ignore bad behavior no matter how much you like a person. You've got to follow your disciplinary action plan the way that it's designed, because failing to do so can help develop either a discrimination case if other people are treated differently, or it can show that you didn't take action in the way that you should have. And then the last thing about telematics is that a lot of it is designed and focused on what people do wrong. And that can create a lot of negativity, right? People don't really like that. They're being watched all the time, especially when they only hear bad things about themselves. So think about how this data can be used for recognition, and that's something we're going to come back to in a few minutes. When it comes to recognizing drivers, it is important to think about what it is you want to recognize, right? Recognizing drivers for not having any accidents is pretty common, but that doesn't mean that they're not speeding or running stop signs. It just means they haven't had an accident yet. So I recommend that you consider rewarding your drivers for the things that you want them to do, right? Recognize them for doing what you want them to do. So things like drivers who consistently submit their vehicle inspections, drivers who ensure that their vehicle is clean and well maintained, drivers who don't have flags based on their telematics data. All of that helps you redirect their behavior, right? So think about what you want from your drivers and then find ways to use rewards if you're using them to push them in that direction. And we touched on this before, but just like any other disciplinary action plan, the one for your drivers does have to be used consistently, right? Make sure that it doesn't create a basis for accusations of discrimination or favoritism. And then make sure you're following that plan and everybody's following it exactly the same way, making sure that your vehicles are operated safely. Supervisors cannot modify how they handle situations or follow different plans for disciplinary action, right? Everybody's got to be on the same page. So I hope that this talk has brought up some different ideas, some ways of looking at fleet, thinking about liability exposures and controls that you can take back and apply to your programs. But I also wanted to talk about some ideas for emerging technology, things that we've seen lately. So the first item is something that I mentioned back when we talked about MVRs, right? There are companies out there that provide real-time monitoring of your employees' motor vehicle records and can notify you if there are convictions, including suspensions. This is really important for ensuring that you're notified when these things occur instead of finding out in a year when that an employee is not eligible to drive anymore, right? While we encourage employees to notify us of these things, right, they're not always going to feel comfortable saying, hey, I got a ticket or I got a DUI, right? So this tool makes sure that you know either way, okay? Distracted driving continues to result in accidents, even with hands-free devices. And there are apps out there that can be used to prevent employees from using their phones when they're driving a company vehicle. It's a great way to ensure that employees aren't texting or responding to text while they're driving for work. This app can be modified to fit within your organizational structure so that if your employee has to be notified of something by dispatch, it can actually just tell the driver to pull over and call in, or it can allow hands-free devices if that's what your policy permits. So it's flexible and it hands you a tool to prevent a really common cause of motor vehicle accidents. We just touched on driver recognition. There's a company that can tie into your telematics data to monitor and score your drivers based on their driving behavior. And then that score can be tied to monetary recognition. So this company also has an app that employees can use to track their score. So they're getting constant feedback and they can see where they are at any time, right? So if they had a bad day today, but that gives them the motivation maybe to focus tomorrow and have a better day and get a little bit more bonus built in, right? So that's a great tool. And then finally, there's another company that's found a way to assess drivers for risky behaviors, and that can help with identifying coaching and training needs before an incident even occurs. So this is a great way to gain insight into your driver's likely behaviors so you can address them and manage them before anything goes wrong. If you're a Safety National client, you can feel free to reach out to your risk control manager if you want more information about these resources. I want to thank you guys for joining the webinar today and learning more about fleet safety. Before I take questions, I wanted to leave you with both some questions and some takeaways, right? So things I want you to use to assess your fleet exposures and controls. So the first question I would ask is, who's driving on behalf of your company, right? Sometimes we're focusing on the wrong people and we're not thinking about everyone who's driving. So make sure that you've captured everyone. Next, do you know that all of your drivers meet your eligibility criteria? Again, if we haven't identified all of the drivers that we have, we might not have vetted everyone. So make sure that you have vetted all of your drivers, not just the ones who are in driver-specific roles, right? Have all of your drivers been trained? Do they know what the expectations are around cell phone use? Do they know who to notify if they're in an accident? Do they have the right paperwork and insurance, right? All of that is really important. So make sure that your drivers have the training and they know what your expectations are. Can you demonstrate that your vehicles are properly maintained and in good condition? Do you have the documentation to show that? If you're able to say yes to all of those questions, you may be in pretty good shape. But if you're not sure about any of them, I would encourage you to dig into it and just make sure that it gets addressed. And key takeaways. So we often expect that by the time we're hiring someone to drive, they already know how to do it and therefore they're safe drivers. When somebody drives for business purposes, though, and they represent the organization and that relationship between employee and employer creates that liability exposure, right? Whether they're driving a company vehicle or a rental car, it doesn't matter. That liability exposure is there. So we have to have the right controls in place to make sure that we're picking the right people to drive, that they have the training that they need, that they know what our expectations are. A strong fleet policy that's identified your auto exposures and designed policies that are in line with your risk appetite, those can help to address this issue. So train your drivers to understand your expectations, make sure those are laid out in your policies, and then reinforce the expectation that your drivers have to follow traffic safety laws. Where you might have found gaps in your policies and controls, consider some of the tools that we talked about today and other things that are available out there to help. I want to thank you guys for joining the webinar today and participating in the poll questions. I genuinely hope that you learned at least one new thing that you can take back to work with you to help make someone safer. Okay, so I saw some questions popping up. Let's see what we got. So a few of you are asking about motor vehicle record monitoring companies. Some states have these. State of California has one that you can use that's just from the state. There are several companies out there. What we could do maybe is provide a list of different options. There are several out there. Obviously, we're not going to recommend any one. You have to decide what's best for your organization. Let's see. If your organization is using telematics, do you have to legally notify employees this data is being collected? You should. You want to make sure that your employees understand that you're using this data to ensure that drivers are safe, right? If you have cameras, you're going to have to legally notify them anyways. So it depends on how you're set up and what you're doing. but you're going to be coaching them anyways, right? If you have telematics data, you're going to be coaching them, you're going to be talking to them about the data that you're seeing. So I think it's very important to make sure that employees know. It builds trust too, right? So if you're monitoring employees or you're doing things like that and you're not talking to them about it and they find out later, you've really breached their trust. So I think it's really important to be open and honest about these things and to be transparent. This one says, sometimes community vehicles or shared are in the worst condition because no one takes ownership. Yeah, this is absolutely true. And the problem with that is when nobody takes ownership, nobody wants to take that car out because their car has broken down. So absolutely, great point. Do you have a recommendation for how often we should review driving records of ongoing employees? I would say at a minimum, at a very minimum, at least once a year. But think about it this way, if you go an entire year between looking at driving records, then a lot can happen in that time. And so if your employee does get a DUI or they are convicted of multiple tickets, this suggests that they have risky behavior, you're going to be missing all of that for an entire year. So that's the very minimum amount of time I would let go between. And I would make sure that you have that information and review that information. Let's see, we already saw that one. All right, I'm reading this one to make sure I understand it. The question is, what is the best way to request MVRs for a large number of employees that include both county fleet vehicles and personal vehicles that are used to travel between facilities on a regular basis? Okay, so generally, best practice is to be doing it as it comes, right? So as a new employee is brought in, then you're reviewing their MVR, and then you can review those MVRs on an annual basis. And a lot of times you can work with your broker or your insurance carrier to get those MVRs to review them, or you can work with the companies like we talked about to assess them. It can be a lot of people, and I do acknowledge that. So getting some help for that, I can see how that would be a factor. Again, those companies help with that. So that's one way to go. And then I think there's one more that came in at the end. I mentioned that employers can require employees driving their own vehicles to carry specific limits of insurance. Do you also recommend that they add the employer as an additional insured? I am not an insurance agent or broker, so I would recommend that that's a great question to ask your broker and talk to them about and see what your options are and what you can and can't do. So good question. It's not one that I'm comfortable answering. It's just a little bit outside of my expertise. Looks like we got one more. This is more of a comment. This person says, if you're not part of HR work, the HR work group and your staff are unionized, make sure you're working with HR on any bargaining issues triggered by implementing telematics. Very good point. Excellent. I think we've answered all of the questions that are in here. Any other questions? Looks like I have one more question. Yes. So this person says, if employees drive their own cars, isn't their insurance primary and the company's policy is secondary? Yes, that's right. So their insurance is supposed to pick up the cost of the accident first, and then anything that exceeded their limits would be on the company's policy to pick up. So that ties into what I was saying before. So a couple of things that can happen. First is if their insurance limits are very low. So I'm going to use California as an example again. If the limit is 15,000 per person, 30,000 per accident, that's pretty low. And it's really easy when somebody gets injured in an accident to exceed that $15,000 in medical cost, right? So then the company policy has to pick up at that point, right? So if you require them to have higher coverage, right, then that provides a little more protection to the company. And so that's why talking to your broker about your coverages and expectations is important to make sure that you have good coverage there. And sample driver policy, like a fleet post. Somebody's asking if we can share a driver policy. I can work with our marketing team and see if that's something that we can do when we send out the copy of the presentation today. So I can look into that. And I think that's everything. So thank you guys. Really great questions. Really, really great questions. If you can continue to submit them as we're closing up. If something pops up, I'll answer it. If not, we can include it in the question and answer article that we're going to provide. Thank you so much for joining today and participating and doing all the poll questions. This is a really important topic, and I hope you all got something out of it. So thanks, everyone.